intersection of power, engineering, social structures, and the individual mind. You asked us to connect the dots between socio-cyber engineering, which is basically the science of how society manages complex systems and systemic bias based on demographics, and then bring in the neurodivergent experience, specifically ADHD.
Yeah, it's quite a combination.
So our mission here is to unpack the sort of structural scaffolding that often dictates where people end up, especially looking at minority groups, and then see how the dynamic, high-variety hunter mind associated with ADHD either gets systematically trapped by these rigid boundaries,
And maybe finds an edge.
exactly, or finds a strategic edge to thrive in the, let's face it, inevitable chaos of the modern world.
Okay, so to start, maybe we should look at this from a systems level. Grounded in cybernetics, the study of control and communication in complex systems,
Right.
we're essentially examining how society, as this massive administrative structure, tries to manage the incredibly rich, unique, high variety of individual reality. I mean, think about it. If you have infinite inputs, you just can't manage them all.
You'd be overwhelmed.
Totally. So the system has to simplify. It has to somehow reduce that variety.
So the system has to kind of blind itself to the true complexity of the individuals within it to make things manageable.
Precisely. And there's a term for this necessary process: variety attenuation. It's the mechanism systems use to reduce those infinite inputs of human life into a manageable, low-variety set of categories. Think administrative convenience.
Like data points on a spreadsheet.
Exactly like that. Imagine trying to capture all the nuance of a really detailed oil painting and cramming it perfectly into a two-column spreadsheet. You lose almost everything: the color, the texture, the meaning. It just gets flattened.
That makes sense, yeah, on a theoretical level. The sources we looked at, they don't keep it theoretical, do they? They link this attenuation mechanism directly to, well, entrenched structural bias.
Oh, absolutely. The sources are pretty stark on this. In the American context, this attenuation, this systemic need to simplify, is linked directly to systemic racism.
So?
Well, when a complex administrative system needs to simplify, it's going to latch on to the most convenient, most readily available, already established category. And historically, in America, that category has often been race.
So control and structural racism become sort of functionally inseparable.
That's what the sources argue. It becomes an engineered structural component. It's just the easiest, lowest resistance path for the system to categorize people and often to corral minority groups into, say, less desirable areas or outcomes.
And this structural rigidity, it wasn't just accidental drift, right? It was actually built on an economic foundation laid way back in the 1860s.
Yeah, post-emancipation.
We talk about that era sometimes as a cruel jest. Black Americans were nominally free, sure, but the sources emphasize they were given no land, nothing in reality, to actually start building generational wealth or any kind of economic foundation.
And you absolutely have to look at what was happening at the same time. While Black Americans were being deliberately left without that economic base, the government was distributing millions of acres of land, mainly out west and in the Midwest.
To white immigrants.
Largely, yes, granting them almost instantly the foundation for economic stability that was denied to others.
So that famous phrase, telling someone to lift himself by his own bootstraps, it's just a painful irony in this context.
It really is. One group was essentially handed the boots, the land, the scaffolding for success, while the other group was deliberately left bootless by the system itself, yet somehow expected to achieve the same outcome. It created a massive structural handicap right from day one.
And the result.
The outcome is what the sources call the two Americas. They argue it's the sort of inevitable result of this structural scaffolding, this constant dangerous pattern of predominantly Negro central cities ringed by white suburbs.
So that demographic concentration isn't just random social sorting?
Not according to these analyses, no. It's presented as the logical, almost mathematically predictable outcome of engineered structural differences. Differences designed to simplify, categorize, and separate.
Wow.
And you see the staggering human cost in the statistics. National unemployment might go up or down, but because of this structural failure, youth unemployment in some large urban areas dictated by these boundaries just sits persistently stubbornly at 30%, sometimes even 40%.
That's devastating.
It's the statistical trap created by that attenuation, based on historical race and current location.
Okay, so the system literally has to blind itself to individual reality to maintain control, and it defaults to the easiest historical category, demographics, race, to do that simplification. Okay, so now let's pivot slightly. If the system demands this low-variety, rigid structure, what happens when you introduce a mind that is inherently high-variety, like the neurotype.
This is where cognitive architecture really slams into systemic architecture. The sources draw this powerful contrast between two kind of archetypes, you could say. On one side, you have the dominant farmer mindset. This is a mindset that prefers routine, linearity, specialization. It thrives in the kind of post-industrial standardized workplace. Predictability is key.
And on the other side?
The hunter archetype. This mind is dynamic. It actually thrives in flux, maybe even chaos. It integrates disparate information almost instantly, and it's potentially better suited for environments that are changing really rapidly.
Which sounds more like our modern world, arguably.
You could definitely argue that. But our society, our institutions, especially things like standardized schooling, they've been shaped by centuries of print culture, the Industrial Revolution. It's fundamentally farmer bias.
Now, when you say farmer, is that meant to be, like, derogatory or just descriptive?
Oh, purely descriptive. It's about a preference, maybe even an adaptive need for predictability and routine. It's not a value judgment.
Got it.
But when this farmer bias system encounters the high-variety hunter mindset, it often sees only disorder. Think about standardized schooling, the typical 9-to-5 structure.
Yeah, not exactly tailored for dynamism.
Not at all. These structures tend to pathologize the dynamic, non-linear hunter brain. And that often leads to the ADHD diagnosis. The argument isn't that the brain is fundamentally broken, but that it's mismatched to the operating environment the system demands.
Okay, so there's a mismatch. But where does the racial bias component come back in?
This is where the cognitive mismatch gets absolutely brutalized by the existing structural racism we talked about. When a black child, for instance, exhibits that high variety, maybe disruptive, maybe chaotic hunter behavior.
The system doesn't see mismatch.
Exactly. The existing structural racial bias amplifies the stigma. Instead of thinking cognitive mismatch, the system defaults to labels rooted in those pre-existing stereotypes we discussed. Labels like defiant, rowdy, problematic.
So the bias acts like a magnifier for the negative perception.
The huge magnifier. And that amplification is the key accelerant, isn't it? It stops being just a potential misdiagnosis or misunderstanding of cognitive style.
It becomes a punitive label.
Yes. A punitive label that forces that individual off the standard path to success and basically fast-tracks their entry into that statistical trap, the unemployment, the poverty, that defines what the sources call the other America.
So the system identifies the individual high variety, rejects it through this racialized lens it already has, and then funnels that person straight into the pre-engineered structural failure zone.
That's the dynamic the sources describe. It's a devastating feedback loop.
Okay. So if the system is almost designed to trap this dynamic mind, first by pathologizing it, then stigmatizing it through racial bias, what edge could the hunter possibly possess? You mentioned the ADHD mind being dynamic and integrated, might navigate the complexity and chaos of modern life better than the more linear farmer mind. But how? Especially if you're dealing with internal chaos, too.
Right, that's the crucial next step. And the biggest internal trap the sources highlight is something called chaos seeking.
Chaos seeking? That sounds counterintuitive.
It does, but think about it. The sources suggest the hunter mind is often good at damage control, but bad at damage prevention. It actually excels when things are falling apart, because that's when its integration skills, its rapid response, its ability to see the whole picture under pressure really shine.
Okay. So because it feels competent, maybe even alive when putting out fires, it might unconsciously start lighting them just to feel engaged or useful.
That's the idea, precisely. And this behavior becomes incredibly self-sabotaging, because the very act of chaos seeking actively disables the brain's habit circuitry.
The habit circuit?
Yeah, specifically in a part of the brain called the basal ganglia. This is the very part that helps establish routines and automatic behaviors, which can actually protect against the long-term executive dysfunction often seen in ADHD.
So seeking chaos undermines the brain's own protective mechanisms.
Exactly. It creates this powerful destructive cycle. You seek chaos to feel competent, but the chaos prevents you from building the habits that would reduce the need for constant crisis management.
Wow.
And unsurprisingly, that cycle feeds directly into a really extreme vulnerability when it comes to self-medication and addiction.
Why is the connection?
Well, there are a couple of factors. Neurologically, there might be differences, like lower baseline dopamine levels. But psychologically, there's this desperate need to escape the chronic shame and frustration of failure. Failure often caused by both the internal chaos cycles and the external systemic barriers we discussed.
So it's less about seeking pleasure.
And more about seeking escape. The sources put it bluntly, saying that for someone with ADHD caught in this loop, their addiction resist is functionally like -50. Substances become a desperately needed, albeit destructive, escape mechanism from an overwhelming reality.
Okay, this paints a pretty bleak picture. A cycle fueled by both systemic bias from the outside and internal neurological wiring. How on earth do you break something like that? What did the sources suggest?
The solution proposed is actually quite sophisticated, drawn from cognitive psychology. It's a technique focused on cognitive reframing. The sources use a specific term for the target of this reframing: kleshas.
Kleshta, what does that mean?
Kleshas in this context essentially means the emotional coloring, or the often automatic and destructive associations your mind attaches to an event or a thought. It's a story you tell yourself about the raw data.
Okay.
The technique requires you to practice cleanly separating two things. First, the objective reality, what actually happened, what you can directly observe,
Yeah.
just the facts.
Right.
And second, your mental kleshas, the meaning, the judgment, the emotional spin, the often catastrophic projection you instantly layer on top of that reality.
Can you give an example? Like if I missed a deadline.
Perfect example.
Yeah.
Objective reality, I forgot to send the email before the deadline. That's just a fact.
Okay. And the kleshta.
The kleshas could be, I'm such an idiot, I'm lazy, I'm unreliable, I'll never succeed, my boss hates me now, my career is probably over, all that extra stuff.
Right, the internal monologue spiral.
Exactly. And here's the key. Most people's motivation, their emotional state, responds entirely to the discouraging kleshas, the projection, not the simple objective fact that they missed an email.
So if you focus on the I'm a failure kleshta, you just feel awful and maybe give up.
Precisely. You quit. But if you can train yourself to cleanly separate those two columns, objective reality here, kleshta over there, you strip the emotional power, the destructive force, from the kleshta. You recognize it as just a thought pattern, not fundamental truth.
And then your motivation can respond to the actual situation.
Yes. Your motivation can then respond cleanly, rationally, to the objective reality. A missed email isn't proof you're a failure. It's just objective data, a signal to, say, send a follow-up immediately, apologize if necessary, and maybe figure out a better reminder system.
So it shifts the focus from self-blame to problem solving.
That's it. This is how the high-variety mind, the hunter mind, can shift from what psychologists call a performance mindset, where a single setback confirms a negative kleshta
Yeah.
and makes you want to give up.
To a growth mindset.
Exactly. To a growth mindset, where that exact same setback is perceived purely as objective reality. It's just data, a signal to maybe try twice as hard, to iterate, to learn, to improve. The shame, the paralysis that evaporates when the kleshta is identified as separate from the self, as just mental noise.
That sounds powerful, but probably takes practice.
Oh, definitely. It's a skill. And crucially, achieving consistent performance, especially for the hunter mindset, navigating all this, means focusing intensely on state rather than trait.
State versus trait, what's the difference there?
Trait refers to those fixed deterministic labels we, or the system, slap on ourselves or others. Lazy, stupid, chaotic, smart, organized. These feel permanent.
Right.
State, on the other hand, refers to variable, alterable conditions. Things like your sleep quality last night, your hydration level, the amount of natural light you're getting, the noise level in your environment, whether you exercised. These things fluctuate, and importantly, there are things you can often influence or control.
So instead of thinking, I am chaotic, you think, my state is currently unfocused, maybe because I slept poorly. What can I adjust?
Exactly. You cannot control the system's labels, the historical biases, or maybe even the underlying neurology completely. But you can manage your state, and focusing on optimizing your state sleep, nutrition, environment, managing the kleshta that becomes the ultimate control mechanism for the high-variety mind to actually perform and succeed, despite the system's inherent tendency to simplify, categorize, and potentially trap you.
This whole deep dive, it really reveals this fundamental conflict, doesn't it? Systemic control seems to rely on this attenuation, this categorization, this imposing of a low-variety reality for efficiency's sake.
Yeah, administrative neatness over individual complexity.
But the individual, especially this high-variety hunter mind, can push back, can resist, not by changing the whole system overnight, but by mastering their internal perception, managing their state, and refusing to fully accept the system's narrow, often punitive labels.
And it's worth remembering that this mechanism of control, of attenuation, runs incredibly deep. It even gets baked into the language we use every single day.
How so?
The sources point out something fascinating. The very act of linguistic categorization, putting a label on something complex, actively fragments what might have been a unified neural experience. It actually reduces its perceived intensity, maybe by as much as 25% to 40%.
Wow, just naming it changes how we feel it.
Apparently so. The collective mind, which is mediated by the labels we choose and agree upon, effectively determines which version of reality solidifies, which one endures, and which details get lost in the simplification.
Okay.
So here's our final thought for you to maybe mull over this week, drawn straight from this material we've been discussing. We know from other research mentioned in the sources that collective memories, even false ones, can fade pretty significantly around the 10 to 11 day mark.
Right.
And we've just talked about how language itself actively fragments the original unified complex experience. So the question to ponder is this. What responsibility do you carry when you assign a definitive label, maybe a simple, neat label, to a really complex social crisis, or even to a personal failing in yourself or someone else? Knowing that your linguistic choice, that label, actually helps force reality into that defined, attenuated state. It simplifies it. And when that original, complex, unified experience inevitably decays or gets forgotten, who actually benefits from its loss? Who benefits from the simplified version taking hold? Something to think about as you navigate the reality streams this week.